So at this point, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Her Honor, who is going to favor us with a keynote address. The Honourable Elizabeth Dowdeswell was appointed Ontario's 29th Lieutenant Governor last September. She is passionately devoted to the advancement of humanity. She cares deeply about the environment, which she considers the fundamental basis for life on Earth. She has led provincial, federal, and international institutions and has served on the boards of corporate and non-profit organizations. Her years as an Undersecretary General of the United Nations in the 1990s profoundly shaped her worldview and continue to inform her thinking. As Lieutenant Governor, the focus of her mandate is Ontario in the world. For the betterment of Ontario and the world, Ontario can both learn and lead. Ms. Dowdeswell was born in Northern Ireland, is an officer of the Order of Canada, and holds 10 honorary degrees. I've only known her since she had about 8 of them, so my colleague Jean-Pierre has known her longer than I. Ladies and gentlemen, Mesdames et Messieurs, please join me in welcoming the Honourable Elizabeth Dowdeswell, Lieutenant Governor.
Good evening, everyone. Friends, particularly whom I haven't seen for quite some time. It's a delight to become reacquainted. But I must say I feel a little sorry for you because you're sitting at tables with no food on them, and that means that I will try and be brief. But I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be with you this evening. It's really more than just an honor to be here. It's a definite pleasure to see so many people that I've met at various chapters of my life. Those of you who know me know that I haven't been able to keep a job for very long, and so I've meddled in more things than most people think of. But I do feel as if I'm at home here this evening. My connections with Learning for a Sustainable Future and with David Bell, as he said, go back to the 90s, when some far-sighted educators and business people had a vision about how they would change education in Canada. Little did we know that LSF would not only be successful and still exist, but would later influence organizations like UNESCO and also many other countries along the way. That was a time of vibrancy and intense activity in the field of environment. Scientific advances fueled citizen awareness, and that led to evidence-based policy development and organizational change. At home and on the world stage, impressive Canadians were engaged. See how many of these you remember. The negotiations on climate change and biodiversity, culminating, of course, in the remarkable Earth Summit. The political acceptance and legitimacy of the concept of sustainable development, a concept that was so very seductive, somehow bringing together economic, environmental, and socio-cultural considerations promised much improved decisions. The launching of the Globe series of conferences on business and the environment. The formation of the International Institute of Sustainable Development in Winnipeg, the creation of the Roundtable on Environment and Economy, the introduction of Environment Canada's Eco-Logo, the Environmental Choice Program, the establishment of the International Centre for Sustainable Cities in Vancouver, the hosting of EcoEd, Education and Communication for Environment and Development, really the first follow-up to the summit, and the conceptualization of environmental citizenship program and eco-action. I mention these examples of initiatives because they really provide context to the origins of this organization and its remarkable persistence and dedication over more than 2 decades. So it really is a time to say congratulations. There's a wonderful Woody Allen story in which he's giving an address at a commencement exercise. And he tells the students that they are at a crossroads. One path leads to utter hopelessness and despair, the other to extinction. And he hopes that they have the wisdom to choose wisely. I'm always reminded of that story as I think about describing the state of the world, because the fact is that for far too many people, it is a depressing story. Whether we're measuring environmental harm, social inequalities and injustices, or economic hardship, hardly a day goes by without another bad news story. 2/3 of humankind fall far short of having a decent quality of life, and for them, sustainable development is clearly and charitably a work in progress. But I'm an incurable optimist. My observations and comments this evening actually come from a place of hope. And quoting alarming statistics may be far less dangerous than complacency. For I do believe that no environmental issue has yet emerged that is not within the capabilities of the human race to resolve. We have tremendous knowledge and technological capability, and we have very compelling evidence on most issues for the need to act. But we do need to ask ourselves, how do we achieve a world that works for everyone? Where do we look for vision? Who are the models for inspiration? How do we achieve quantum change? And where's the instruction manual? I know that there must be a better way. Although evidence suggests that the institutions we once trusted may now lack relevance and leadership, they can change. Although many governments and politicians are accused of lacking imagination and being racked with division and partnership, they too can change. And even at the individual level, we're now learning how brains can build new neural pathways. There simply must be a new model of inspiration for institutions and a new operating system for individuals. So on the eve of your symposium on what's worth knowing, educating for the 21st century green economy, the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, as David preempted me, warns that the brown economy of capitalism will require 2.5 planet Earths, and thus it must be replaced by a new green economy. At the same time, Davos just told us recently that the #1 risk factor for all countries in the world was going to be water. And that, considering the economic risks that they usually put forward as key elements, was quite a surprise to people, that in the next decade that's going to be the greatest risk for countries. That economy needs to be guided by the integration of social, economic, and environmental well-being. For the question really isn't whether or not change will come about, it's rather how it will come about. Will we be thrust from crisis to crisis, trying to adapt and solve one problem only to discover it's fundamentally connected to many others? Or will we be more proactive and develop shared visions of what life could be like in the 21st century? More of a cooperative and collaborative world where social and environmental capital are as important as economic capital. In that context, what's the most strategic role for LSF? Having read Dr. Bell's paper on 21st century education and looked at your website, I actually realized that there's not much that I can add about the direction of education for the 21st century, which you don't already know, or you're positioned much better than I am to do so. And I know that tomorrow, through your symposium, you're going to address the issues of knowledge, skills, values, perspectives, and practices essential to a sustainable future. So perhaps I can simply look big picture and underscore and support 3 items for your consideration. And in many ways they may sound like motherhood, but they do need to be repeated. First, I take as fundamental the power of education and the consequent leadership of teachers, and I don't necessarily mean classroom teachers, teachers of all kinds, in developing a new generation of environmental citizens. Citizens of all ages and places who understand both their rights and their responsibilities, but also citizens who equip themselves with appropriate knowledge and make a personal commitment to act. Secondly, I've witnessed the results of thinking holistically and systemically, recognizing that learning from many disciplines and sectors actually causes us to see the world in new ways, ways of thinking that go much beyond very discrete and siloed disciplines, to thinking of relationships, connectedness, and context. The English philosopher Bertrand Russell used to tell a story that I'm very fond of, and this story was about his visit to China in the 1920s. He was greatly taken by the country, and so he asked the president of the country's leading university whether he could apply for a job, a faculty job. Well, needless to say, the president of the university was delighted and asked him whether he was principally a mathematician or principally a philosopher. Russell thought about it for a while and then finally said that he was neither, as he was interested in the dialogue between the two disciplines. The president shook his head and said, "Sorry, you can either be a mathematician or a philosopher, but you can't stand on the cracks in between." Well, the problem, as Russell pointed out, is that, of course, standing on the cracks is exactly where all the action is. The principles of ecology would suggest that we educate ourselves not only about toxic chemicals or endangered species. Understanding life is about recognizing patterns, taking an holistic view in which, for example, one species' waste is another's food. In our quest to create sustainable communities, an education that celebrates diversity, cooperation, partnership, and networking will be essential. And finally, a comment about change and resilience. In this age of blinding technological change, integrated economies, blurring sovereignty, and heightened security concerns, change is inevitable and resilience a common goal. Science and technology will certainly provide some answers, but in many ways that's the easy part. Changing attitudes and behaviors, both of individuals and institutions, will continue to be the real challenge. Because what sustainability demands is a change in the way we behave, a change in our attitude toward the world, and so enter education. It seems that many of us, whether we're NGOs, businesses, governments, are all operating without a shared consensus on actually how effective change comes about. It isn't that our goals are necessarily conflicting, but our strategies often pit us one against the other. If we truly want to get ahead of the issues before the brown economy fails, then I think we need to understand much better how social change actually occurs. Without that, how can we prioritize or even coordinate our actions to the most impact? From the field of social psychology, we learn that the structure of a situation affects the process or interaction of those involved, behavior, and those in turn affect attitudes. And by structure, I mean legal and financial frameworks, infrastructure, technologies, and social structures. That all sounds logical and straightforward, yet most of those are not considered in the kind of decision-making that we do. As June Jacobs pointed out, the design of the streets and amenities in communities can increase or decrease their safety, vitality, sense of identity, and social inclusion or exclusion. The design of schools and other buildings affect how people interact, perceptions of power, and the formation of social groups. The influence of regulations on seat belts or smoking saved lives and health costs, regardless of people's initial attitudes. And as a result of changes to those structures, attitudes finally changed over time. So I hope that LSF might consider identifying those structures, processes, and attitudes which most affect our sustainability, to analyze their impacts, and to develop strategies to strengthen those that support the changes that we need and help remove barriers that are in the way. We know from others who have led the way that diverse groups make better decisions than single experts, that deliberative democracy yields greater commitments to outcomes, and that interaction builds social capital, which enhances resiliency and contributes to a sense of well-being. And that, I think, applies whether you're talking about curricula and processes in schools, or in higher education, or in the community at large, which I consider LSF to be concerned about. If all that sounds much too academic for an evening dinner, I do apologize. I understand that the expectations of our educational system, both formal and informal, and of our teachers, is absolutely profound. So I do want to support and encourage you. But I also understand that no one individual or sector of society acting alone will be able to bring about the change that is required. And equally profound is my faith in young people. They are simply inspiring. The answer to many global and local problems we face lies not in becoming permanently indignant. Hope begins not with wishing our problems would go away, or ignoring them, or denying them, or concluding that scientists must be wrong. Hope begins when we actually have a willingness to change. Thank you for allowing me to share some very brief thoughts with you tonight. I wish you much success tomorrow and in the future, because you can make a difference. And in the words of one of the best advertising and most successful advertising companies in the world, nothing is impossible. Thank you very much.